Hi everyone. Today's conversation is about incidental learning, listening, and knowing. And before we even start, Debbie and I really want to just express that we come from a place of deeply appreciating the importance of authenticity and sincerity. So as we discuss the different things, topics that come up, as we share stories, we're really doing it from a very honest space and fully acknowledge that your experiences might be similar or might be very different from ours. So we really hope that you enjoy engaging in some of these conversations. If you're a parent and you've just started the journey, we understand what that can feel like, and we hope that some of our experiences can leave you feeling that you really aren't alone on this journey. And if you're a seasoned parent, I hope you listen with just a fondness of knowing that there's a sense of sameness there. And if you are a professional in any space listening, we really trust that this is insightful and that you are able to learn a lot too from this. And lastly, if you're a family member or friend of anybody who's either recently started the journey of raising a deaf child or it's been something they've been on for a while, it's so valuable to have people come around them that make them feel less alone and who are also willing to learn. It's not just the parent's responsibility to do all this learning and exploring and navigating, but knowing that they have people doing it with them is extremely comforting. So as we kick off today, this topic of incidental learning was something quite new to me, even in a medical space. It wasn't something that I'd really learned much about, had never really appreciated before. And certainly as I embarked my journey, it was something that became quite important for me to always have on my radar. At a later stage, we're going to have a discussion about some key pointers, 10 top phrases that we embodies parenting the deaf child. And one of mine is doing things deliberately. So this topic of incidental hearing taps into that a little bit, of this deliberate effort to keep your kid in on the different things that are happening in the home. So Debbie, it would be helpful if you could just fill us in with just the basics of what is this thing called incidental hearing, incidental knowing, incidental learning. What are we talking about in this topic?
Yeah. So when we talk about, I'll just call it incidental learning, we are talking about everything that a child, hearing or deaf, or any person learns, any knowledge that they acquire indirectly. So that is without somebody specifically talking to them and giving them information. So it's anything that you hear on the radio, anything that you hear on the TV, any information you acquire that way, anything that conversations that you overhear around the house, in the playground, at school, teachers talking. So it's basically that overhearing, and it is estimated that I've heard some people say 80% of what we know. I've heard other people say 90% of what we know comes from this concept of learning incidentally. So that means that only 10 or 20% of what we know as children or as adults comes from somebody telling us it directly. So everything else, all the other knowledge we acquire incidentally. Bianca, I'm just going to ask you why is this concept so significant to a child who is deaf or hard of hearing?
Oh, it's a good question. I think for me, just even those numbers, the statistics are less of what's important, but rather just knowing that it's a significant thing. And I hadn't really, I suppose for those of us that are learning incidentally all the time, we don't know what it would be like if we didn't.
Absolutely.
And so for a deaf child, essentially deaf babies miss out in the learning from hearing or listening, or that development from quite early on, when the mom is pregnant with them still. And there's definitely cues about our world, about our environment that we get through hearing. Now, before everybody starts feeling low, don't, because it's not all about loss. At the end, we'll touch on about how there are just super powers out there that do compensate in many ways. But because our world has a lot of hearing cues, because the majority of people are hearing, there are things that the deaf child can miss out on. an example, and this is where I kind of think of it more as an incidental knowing, but an example that often caused distress in my family was the child not knowing where I was. So I just hear crying. This is before we even had language, so it wouldn't even be a mom, like you would have in a typical household, and you say, yeah, I'm in the office. It wasn't like that. They'd be crying, and I don't know if they'd fallen or, whatever it was. I couldn't always be at their side. But if I was washing the dishes, for argument's sake, and they had been in the playroom, they couldn't just hear that the tap was on and that's where I was. It was walking in the opposite direction potentially, and then I'd have to try and figure out how I was going to let them know that I was here. And it would have been the sound from the water that a hearing child would have picked up on, that mom's in the kitchen. Let's not worry, we haven't been abandoned. And also just often we'd be going somewhere, whether it be to the shop or whatever, and there's always a good 15 minutes beforehand where you start preparing things, where you start putting your shoes on, or you picking up the keys, checking where they are, or you checking you've got money in your handbag, or there's things that have sound attached to them, whether it's a quick call to someone to say, okay, I'm going to be there in 15 minutes, or whether it's a comment to someone to say, in 20 minutes I'm just going to pop out and get A, B, and C. Those are cues that a typical child would be picking up on and knowing what's about to happen. And that sense of certainty brings a sense of emotional stability.
Absolutely.
And that's where things can lose the plot a little bit with a deaf child, if this is not something that people are aware of and are quite intentional about addressing, is that deaf child is playing, doing what, and then suddenly the mom's gone, or suddenly it's being whipped out of its activity to be put in the car, and we wonder why there's often a meltdown, or there's behavior that we feel is frustrating. And it's because that uncertainty brings some emotional distress. So those are some of the examples in my life that I've seen. Gosh, this incidental learning is not only related to everyday functioning, but there is a link to some emotional distress in that terrible 2 phase that often extends to terrible 4 for some of us.
Yeah.
Where communication is key. So there's a lot of thought that terrible 2 stage is such because, and for any child at 2 years old, there's desire to communicate, but there's not enough tools to do it efficiently, and so there's a meltdown. And so similarly, I'm frustrated because I was enjoying my game. You've whipped me off and put me in the car seat, and we wonder why there's that frustration. The other side of incidental learning, hearing, that's been evident in our home, and again speaks to the intentionality of this journey, is even just with vocabulary development.
Absolutely.
So some words that we might not use in our home, and I'll give you an example. My one daughter, who's, I would have said, had really good vocabulary, was reading to her peer of the same age, her hearing peer. And she got to a point where she read about a boy who was sobbing. And I stopped her, because we'll do another session on just this constant presence of trying to build vocab, etc. But I stopped her and said, hey, what did he mean by the fact that he was sobbing? And she was like, I'm not so sure. And her other little friend, who I know has had a very similar home environment in terms of the language exposure, etc., said it means he was crying a lot. And at that point, her mom and I looked at each other, we're like, that is the difference with incidental hearing. Because she said, look, my daughter, I've never specifically used the word sob. I would have said he's crying. But she would have heard sob used by someone else, whether it's a granny, in the family, whether it's on the radio, whether it's on TV, on a cartoon, anything like that. She would have been exposed to it. Whereas I needed to actively go to my daughter and say, hey, there's another word we use if someone's crying a lot in English, and that word is sobbing. And I'd even spell it for her, write it down, or if you're a signer, you can finger spell it. And it's that intentionality of, wow, these sorts of things, bits of information don't just come, and there's quite a lot of purpose to exposing the kid to it.
Yeah.
What examples can you think of?
Well, I've just had, numerous times where we've been going out somewhere, and my 2 hearing daughters, I've not specifically told anyone we're going out to dinner that night, but they've heard, my hearing children have heard me on the phone. They've heard me shouting across to my husband, we're leaving at 6 or whatever the case is. Whereas my middle daughter, who has 2 hearing aids, hasn't picked up on that. So many times I'm like, okay, are we going? Is everyone ready? And she's like, what? And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to tell you, because with her, I know I have to tell her directly at 6 o'clock, we are leaving, we're going out to dinner. So, yeah, that just happens quite regularly for us. But I just wanted to quickly touch on now that there might be a difference, or let's just sort of talk about the difference between a child who is culturally deaf and only uses sign language, and then a child who is hard of hearing and has amplification. Because in my mind, they might experience this concept of incidental learning differently, but it's very real for both of them. So certainly my deaf daughter who wears 2 hearing aids, yes, she's still got access to sound. She's still got access to speech. She's oral herself. However, she's still not picking up on everything. She might be picking up on a little bit more than a child who doesn't have any amplification. But certainly she's not picking up on everything in a typical way that my hearing daughters are picking up on information, even though she has amplification and she has sound. Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I think it's actually quite a long conversation, but some of the thoughts that come to mind, one is, as you say, so someone who's exposed continuously to a visual form of language, if that's what they access. So say several generations of deaf people, and this is a new baby in the home, or a child that goes to deaf school, and there's a lot of conversation. There's different dynamics there completely. One thing is they'll have visual access to conversations far across. And so they might get incidental knowledge, even that you might not really feel, you necessarily wanted your child to get, because there's just this, there's less privacy in terms of what's being said.
Yeah, there's no whispering. How do you whisper?
I've seen it in my own home. And but yeah, it's definitely, there's less missed if there is a form of access that kid can experience. And certainly in an environment, obviously no deaf child is born with a downloaded language in their brain. So just because they're deaf doesn't mean they know sign language. I've often found people assume that. I'm like, actually they have to learn language, just like every child learns language through exposure. It's not just automated. So a child that has an understanding and then exposed and is learning language, if it's sign language, definitely there'll be less missed because there's always been that exposure. But for 97%, even some studies just declare that it's up to that many deaf babies are born to hearing families, which is why we're doing these podcasts. And that then is where this incidental listening stuff gets missed, because it's hearing and speaking and sounds that dominates the average world of a family with a deaf child, because their parents are hearing. So it is quite different in terms of this incidental knowledge transfer, and it's very interesting. And I'm sure there is a lot out there that we could look into and read up about. But technology is an interesting conversation too, for 2 reasons. One is that I think there's a misnomer out there that technology equals hearing. And whilst it equals access to sound, your kid doesn't become a hearing one. And certainly there are ways and means of improving that access. So in a classroom setting, in a different conversation for another time, an FM system, mini mic, something like that, overcomes a lot of the incidental noises and ambient noises that are causing a problem. But in a home setting, we're not using that all the time. So whilst a child may have great amplification, access to sound, if there's noise, if there's a dog barking, if there's a hardy-does, if there's a motorbike going, they're going to miss information because everything's competing for that access.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing. But at the same time, I can honestly tell you that incidental learning, my kids do have amplification, has definitely become something I've seen develop. And a funny example that I'm not particularly proud of, but I will share, is that a few weeks ago, one of my daughters said a word that I may have used at home, but not to her. And she definitely wouldn't have heard it in other places. Now, don't go and assume particularly what word it was. Let's just say it was a word that you didn't really want your kid to use. And hey, this again is an authentic, honest conversation. None of us.
We've all been there.
And she used it. And I had two simultaneous experience explosions in my brain. One was, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible parent for using that word in her space, an earshot. And the second one was, oh my word, incidental learning is developing.
Yeah.
And I think that trumped my emotional experience. I was like, oh, well, sorry for the exposure. I can repair that and have a little conversation about it and make sure she's not exposed again. But wow, incidental hearing is something that can develop.
Absolutely.
So that has been an interesting personal experience of mine.
Yeah.
I think this topic is really important because it also links to safety and keeping our kids safe.
Absolutely.
And so Debbie, I've got a question that I wonder if you could just unpack a little bit for us, and that is, how does this relate to safeguarding? And then once we've appreciated how it relates to safeguarding, and just for anybody listening, safeguarding means keeping your child safe, essentially. And as a parent, putting in boundaries and putting in different strategies to maximize your child's safety. And we're going to have lots of discussions under safeguarding. But how does it relate to that? And then when we finish that, maybe we can look at a couple of strategies in the home that parents out there can think, okay, wow, this is something new for me. But what can I do today to improve the access of information to my child where they might be missing some incidental hearing?
Lovely, great. So two great pieces to unpack there. When it comes to safeguarding, I have done a lot of research into deaf children and safeguarding specifically, and that is because we know that they are in the safety space. Deaf children are significantly more vulnerable than hearing children. So I know as Thrive, that's one of our strategic areas that we focus on. So, but the one, every time I go over my materials, the one thing that dawns on me is that probably if I could pick one key thing that impacts the safeguarding of deaf children, it's this topic of incidental learning. And probably, and again, we will unpack this a lot in different conversations, but really what it is, the key thing is that because, as we've said, due to the incidental learning, the world view of a deaf child becomes restricted. And that certainly happens as they get older. So even just talking about the topic of bullying. So imagine a child who is possibly in a mainstream setting, and they might be a teenager or a 12-year-old or an 11-year-old, and all the other kids are sitting in their groups on the playground having conversations around what's new, what's hip. They're using slang words. The conversation is quick and it's going like this. But the child who is hard of hearing in that setting is not picking up on all of that. So apart from them feeling really anxious, they now don't understand all the social norms relevant to their age group. And this becomes a significant thing as our kids go through the teenage years. So that sets a ground for your child being seen as different. And that sets a ground for bullying. And again, that's a whole new topic we can go into, but that's one of the first things. Another very significant thing is that deaf children, because their worldview is restricted, they don't always understand. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah. We'll go with it. It happens on international forums.
Sorry about that. Because their worldview is restricted, a deaf child doesn't automatically understand what behaviors are appropriate and what behaviors are not appropriate. So that firstly, as I've said, it comes from themselves and their setting. Socially, there's certain things that are cool or appropriate and certain things that are not at different age groups. But it also comes to other people's behavior. So when a child is exposed at different ages to adults, they don't always understand that an adult doing something to them is not appropriate. Whereas a hearing child has a better grasp, a better understanding of that, and they will therefore seek action or seek help if something happens to them. That's actually probably the most significant thing. But then something else also just to mention is that our kids learn so much about their bodies, about growing up, and about relationships. They learn so much incidentally about that. So a deaf child who's not accessing that feels out of control. It feels out of control. They have a lower understanding of how to act responsibly with their bodies and how to act respectfully towards others with their bodies. If they don't understand the physical changes and the sexual changes that happen as kids grow up, it leaves them with a real feeling of being out of control, and then also not knowing what to do with different relationships, not knowing that a sexual relationship is different to a relationship with a friend, is different to another type of relationship. And that really leaves them vulnerable. There's also the topic of emotional intelligence. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's exactly what we've spoken about. It's the vocabulary, but specifically the emotional vocabulary, and the emotional understanding, which also impacts safeguarding. I'm not going to, I won't go into that now, because I think I would love for us to do an entire session. So if you're listening, look out for that. It's possibly my favorite topic, talking about emotional intelligence and specifically strategies we can use with deaf children.
We got a new puppy.
But really,
We got a puppy.
Okay. I've got Maxine here, who's desperate for me to tell everyone that we got a new puppy. Tell them that we got a new puppy, she says.
Well, nothing is quite as exciting, is it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The point I wanted to make, and that was that with everything you've said, as a parent, irrespective of the hearing status of my kids, that kind of safety stuff I would always own as my responsibility to bring awareness and teaching. But the reality is, and where it becomes a relevant link to incidental learning, is that because these topics unfortunately have so much taboo like around them, much of what the average child is learning out there is through incidental learning of it.
Yeah.
Conversations I've either heard older children speaking about, or siblings, TV, these other influences that quite honestly I wouldn't want for my child. And this is one of the little nuggets here, because we're going to talk about this as well. Is this for me? Whilst we identify this as a potential hazard and that it needs purposeful, intentional intervention,
absolutely,
I turn it around and say, thank goodness I get to be the person that can influence the way my child thinks about that, because they're missing out on the rubbish incidental stuff out there. And there are many moments like this on this journey where I think, wow, it's a gift.
Absolutely. Gift. I agree with you. I agree with you completely. So they might know things, but they might have learned it in a way that is actually not healthy for them. And a lot of what they learn could very well be incorrect. Yeah. Just to touch on, there was another question you said, I think you just said in terms of strategies. So let's just touch on that quickly before we close. I think, for me, the first point is being aware of it, which is exactly why we're having this conversation in the first place, is so that, especially if you're a new parent, or not a new, but yes, well, a new parent to a deaf child, it's just being aware of it is so important, and then making other people in your child's life aware of it. I'm even thinking, teachers. My daughter's just started this term. Actually, yesterday was her first day in a mainstream school setting. One of the first things I did was I made sure that her teacher was aware of this concept of incidental learning. And there's maybe, if they're doing different sports, make sure that the sports coaches understand this, so that they are more likely to include them and to speak directly to them. And then also for the child themselves to be aware of it, and thereby become aware of having to self-advocate around this, because that's a skill that they will use for their whole life, to understand that they might not be accessing everything. And if they realize that something is going on, that they've realized that they've missed something, to ask that is a fantastic skill we can teach our kids, to ask, whether it's the teacher, whether it's another parent, whoever it is, the adult in charge, or as they grow into adults, anybody, to really self-advocate and to ask about that. And then just the third thing I would say, and then you might want to add 1 or 2 points, is really be active about teaching your kids. So we use that, our dinner time conversation, as that. At dinner time, I'm very conscious of making sure that my middle daughter is not left out of conversations. If she speaks up, and sometimes I understand, right, she's missed that, we stop, we fill her in on conversations. We're much more aware, and I'm not saying we do it perfectly, but we're aware of filling her in on conversations that have happened that she might not have accessed. Yeah.
I think, so it is critical to be able to communicate with your kid. And we all start at one point. So whether it's just charades to start off with, there's a starting point there, and there's absolutely nothing wrong, because that's a form of communication. But obviously we're wanting to go to a deeper level of communication. We won't get into that in this conversation, but that's important to say, how am I going to get a message through? Because stopping your kid and saying, listen, you would do this with a hearing kid. Even sometimes you got 10 minutes until we're leaving or whatever, just so that they're not having to stop their play, but they can prepare themselves. It would be a similar strategy at home to say, we're going to be going to the store at about lunchtime, so you've got about an hour left to play with your Lego. Just basically letting them know what is going to happen. But that requires communication. So that's an important tool to have in your toolbox to enable you to be intentional about allowing your child to access information so they don't miss out. The other thing I would say is, what I learned is that I needed to tell my kid if I was going somewhere else in the house. So if they were all, looking at books or playing with something, say for argument's sake in the playroom or the lounge or something like that, and I wanted to go and take a shower, I would need to go to them and say, I'm going to take a shower, because they can't just hear that I'm in the shower. So that when they were looking for me, they know where to look at. I mean, we all know none of us get anything private, but otherwise they at least aren't distressed at this feeling of sudden abandonment, because they can't find mom and they don't know where I am and whatever. And then I would say that you need to adjust your lens for how you see the world. So I became very aware of the vocabulary I wasn't exposing them to, and that's a strange awareness of something that isn't. It's strange. And something that grew that awareness in me was reading to them. So even in the ordinary children's books, I'd read and I'd say, wow, the word toad, I don't think my kid has ever heard. They know frog only, but it's come up in this book. I need to make a note that next time we see a frog or a picture of a frog, I'm going to say, it has another word, and frog and toad might be a little bit different. And I had to have a conversation about that. And same with sob. My example of sob and cry is to not ignore the fact that there's an embellishment of language that can happen. And this can happen in whatever modality. So if it's English, it's just a different word. If it's sign language, there will be differences in the way you sign cry and sob. And then you'd want to expose them to how the word is different. Cry and sob are two short words and they look different. And you might write it down or finger spell it. But so it's totally possible to do it in any modality. So bringing that awareness to this vocabulary that you might not always use. This is a conversation for another day, but one thing I have found early on was that I was so relieved by an ability to communicate with them with a basic battery of vocabulary that it required an active effort to build on that.
So if I was actually going to say that myself, totally. They feel
sad, she's crying. I would use it all the time. We know what it means. Why are you crying? I want to understand how you're feeling. Great. I mean, that's sufficient communication. But if I'm wanting their vocabulary to increase so that they can become independent learners and readers, I have to continuously be thinking, what are words I can use instead? So
absolutely.
Earlier this morning, it really looked like you were sobbing about the fact that, etc., and bring that vocab. So actually, I have a small book that looks a lot like that lives in my handbag. And every time we come up with a new word that I didn't think they'd been exposed to, or I read in a children's story, usually because I want it to be age-appropriate language, or something that is different, I'll jot it down. And we keep it then in my bag. So sometimes we'll look at it or I'll use it. If I'm waiting for them at school, to fetch them at school, I'll quickly go through them and remind myself, okay, let's try and use those 3 words later today, and bring that exposure. So this intentionality is very real. It's something we'll tap on again, but it's definitely linked to incidental learning.
Yeah. I'm so glad you ended on that, because I was going to say that myself in closing. It's just that, well, firstly, don't underestimate your child. And think that they can only cope with a small amount of vocab and they've only barely grasped this. So let's just keep it at that. Don't and I've been guilty of that underestimating, but do not be afraid to expose them to a wonderfully huge range of vocab. And even if that's, even if you don't have, a multitude of different sounds for one word, writing it down, all of that is building on literacy. Yeah, so that's fantastic.
And for anyone feeling overwhelmed by that, it's all a stepwise approach. So we certainly will have a completely separate conversation how one does that. If you're starting off, start with charades,
Totally.
and start with your next 3 words and work on those and build that battery of vocabulary up. Don't let this conversation stress you. Let it inspire you to know that more is certainly possible and that others are doing it too. I just wanted to end on a positive. And while we talk about this incidental learning, when we say learning, aside from listening, because it's incidental listening that we've been talking about and how that's related to learning and knowing. If we decide to use the terms incidental learning and incidental knowing, we know that we have more than just one sense, and that's the sense of listening to sound. And those senses include our vision, they include our taste, they include our smell, they include our touch, and they include other senses that we can't quite put our finger on, but just a sense of knowing. And one thing's for sure is that deaf kids have heightened sensitivity in these other areas. And so don't underestimate them. Agreed. But also sometimes bringing new parents on this journey, it's part of the process of acceptance. Also find it hard sometimes to believe that their child has a hearing loss that's significant. And many times I've found with chatting to parents, part of the reason for this, like, are they really that deaf? Like, can they really not hear me? Is linked to what they've experienced as their child using other ways to learn incidentally. So whether it be reflections in the window in the lounge and they turned, whether it be smell, that's been a big one in our family. My kids will know who's walked into the room or someone's walked into them because they think smell has changed. It might be some other sense that's given them this ability to learn and to experience and to know incidentally that can make the hearing loss seem less. So that's also just an important point, because I think that process of acceptance, which is another conversation, is an important one, because it allows one to really take this bull by the horns, so to speak, and just engage as best as you can on this journey with your deaf child.
Wonderful.
So thank you, everybody, for listening and enjoying the conversation, for bearing with us with the real life interruptions at home during lockdown. That is very, very real. And yeah, we look forward to the next one. We thought that one of our next topics would be something along the lines with a couple pointers for parents that have just found out that their child was deaf. Where to from here? So we look forward to sharing that with you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely.
Thank you, Debbie.
Bye. Cheers, Bianca.